remember that when I was in college, in my senior year, I had to fill up some elective requirements, and so I took a 2-hour course in hymnology. Hymnology is the study of hymns. And the professor in this course was not only a professor of music at the college, but he was also the organist at the college and was quite an accomplished virtuoso. And his passion was classical music, and he loved to tell us about the works of Handel and Bach and Mendelssohn. And by the same token, he had an utter disgust for most traditional evangelical hymnody. He was convinced that most of our famous evangelical songs were written first in saloons and were used later in roller skating rinks. And the one song that he hated more than any other song was the classic song, "In the Garden." He was convinced that this was at best an all skate. And so he used to rail against the maudlin lyrics of the song and of the simple melody and so on. Well, of course, he was so fussy about this, and he had a piano in his studio where the class met on the second floor of the conservatory. And I made it a point to memorize the song "In the Garden" on the piano. And so one day before he got to class, I positioned myself there at the piano, and I had a lookout, watch out the window, and to signal me when the professor approached. And as he started up the stairs to his classroom, I began to sing, or to play on the piano. He comes to the garden alone, or I come to, however that goes. And I was playing the song, and he had apoplexy. And his reaction was so great that we did it every day, the whole semester. And since that time, I've thought a lot about that hymn and have had some laughs about the lyrics of it. I come to the garden alone when the dew is still on the roses and all of that. And then you get to the refrain where it says, "And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and that he tells me I am his own." And as I reflect on it now as an adult, I think that if I could have any experience that would satisfy my soul, it would be just once to have the opportunity to see Jesus in the flesh and to walk with him, to speak with him alone, and to have him say to me audibly, "R.C., you are mine. You belong to me." If I could hear our Lord say that to me, everything would be all right. Now, that may be very maudlin and very superficial and not have the crescendos of Mendelssohn or the arpeggios of Bach, but it speaks to the deepest desire that is in every Christian's heart, to have a real personal relationship with Christ. I think back to the New Testament days when Jesus died, and we have that glorious account of what happened on the day of resurrection when two of his disciples who had quit, they gave up, and they were going back home to Emmaus. And Jesus comes and falls in along with them in an incognito way. Somehow God prevented these disciples from recognizing Jesus immediately. And they're talking about all the things that had taken place. And Jesus innocently says, "What are these things that you're talking about?" And they're irritated, and they say, "You're the only person in Jerusalem doesn't know what's happened." Jesus says, "No, tell me about it." And so he listens as he hears their despairing report about his death and the rumors of his resurrection. And then the New Testament says that Jesus began with Moses and all of the prophets and opened up the scriptures about himself to these two men. And then when they reached their destination in Emmaus, they sat down at table, and when Jesus broke bread, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And then one turned to the other and said, "Did not our hearts burn within us when he opened the scriptures to us on the road to Emmaus?" Every time I read that passage, I can relate to it because I feel that's what would happen to me, that my heart would feel like it was on fire, like it was going to explode right out of my chest if I had the opportunity to see him. But the biggest problem that we have, I'm convinced, as Christians, the thing that makes our testimony, our commitment so weak, and our obedience so inconsistent, is that we have committed ourselves to a God who is totally invisible. That's our problem. We live our Christian life feeling constantly the absence of God because we can't see him. Now, how do we deal with it? How do we deal with the fact that we are called to serve a God who does not seem to be present? We can't see him, we can't hear him, taste him, touch him, smell him. I remember the famous parable of the philosopher Anthony Flew, where he told the story of these two explorers who were in the deepest part of the rainforest in the interior of Africa, and they were hacking their way through the jungle with machetes, and suddenly in the midst of no man's land, 1,000 miles from any civilization, they found this garden with all of the plants in the garden arranged meticulously in perfectly symmetrical rows. And there were no weeds between the stalks of vegetables that were growing, perfectly cultivated and cleaned up. And the first explorer said, well, there must be a gardener here that's doing this, because you can't have this kind of order and this kind of harmony and symmetry without an intelligence taking care of the garden. He said, let's wait and see if we can meet the gardener. If the gardener comes back. Well, they waited a day and no gardener came, and the other explorer began to be antsy. He said, we've got to get on with our exploration. Let's move on. This gardener's not going to show up. And he said, well, maybe the gardener is invisible. Maybe he's coming in here and tending the garden and we just can't see him. And so they decided to rig a trap, and they spread wires all around the perimeter of the garden, and they attached bells to it. And that night, the bells didn't ring. And the explorer said, see, there's no invisible gardener here. And then the first explorer was assistant. He said, well, let's figure out a way to find out, maybe this gardener is not only invisible, but maybe he's immaterial. And because he's a spirit, he doesn't trip over wires or make the bells ring. And by this time, the second explorer was getting fed up with all of this. And he said, wait a minute, time out. He said, first you talked about a real live gardener. Next thing you're talking about an invisible gardener. Next thing you're talking about is a spiritually invisible gardener. He said, what's the difference between your spiritual invisible gardener and no gardener at all? And then the skeptical philosopher Flew said, that's where modern man finds himself, living in a world where God has died the death of 1,000 qualifications. So that for all practical purposes, there's no difference between an infinite, eternal, invisible spirit being and know God at all. Except there's a garden. And the garden is real. And Professor Flew has not been able yet to account for the garden. But he certainly put his finger upon an aching dimension of the church and the church's life. See, we counter this business about the feeling of the absence of God and the fact that He is invisible by saying that God is an infinite spirit. Now, what I want to do in this session and in the next session is give a brief introduction to these two concepts, because both of them are very important to our understanding of the character of God. And we've got to deal with two very, very abstract ideas here. To say that God is an infinite spirit, and for that to mean anything to us, we have to have some idea of what infinite means. And that's hard enough. And then we have to deal with another problem, and that is, what is a spirit? Or what is a spiritual being? Well, I think one of the most difficult concepts that we can ever wrestle with is this concept of the infinite, or of infinity. I remember a math professor who was faced with this problem. He was trying to explain the idea of infinity to his students in the classroom. And the student said, please, professor, I can't understand what infinite means. And so the professor went to the blackboard, and he started on the left side of the blackboard with a piece of chalk, and he said, well, I'm going to show you what an infinite line looks like. And he started to draw across the blackboard, and he went clear to the end of the room, went across the wood, took the chalk, went out around the wall, over the door, across the windows, all the way back around the back and up the other side of the room, and came back and joined the line back here. He said, that's what infinity is. A line that doesn't quit. Now, he could have just as easily done it like that and saved himself a trip around the room. But, you know, where does that line start and where does it finish? And he was trying to give some idea of infinity, but actually, infinity as a word is a word that uses a way of describing things or defining things that we call the way of negation. That is, we say what something is or try to describe something by telling what it isn't. The word infinite simply means not finite. And that which is finite is that which has a definite size and can be measured. It had borders or boundaries to its existence, and we call it finite. But something that is infinite doesn't have any borders of certain types. Now, the professor complicates matters by saying, can we have more than one infinite line? Can we, John? Can you have two infinite lines? Sure, you could start a line down here and make that one go on forever. And we can have, theoretically, an infinite number of infinite lines. So when we say that something is infinite in a line, it's infinite only in one dimension. But here's where the plot thickens, and we get to some really tough stuff. That when we're talking about God, we're talking about one who is an infinite being. One who is an infinite being. He's an infinite spiritual being, but still an infinite being. Now, are there any problems for your mind when you think about God as an infinite being? What God in His infinite being means is that there's no place where God's being isn't present. That's good news, isn't it? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For thou art with me. Jesus says, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. How could Jesus be with us always when He's gone? He's ascended into heaven. How can God be present at more than one place at the same time? Finite beings can't be. But God can be present in Philadelphia and Chicago at the same time because He is infinite in His being. Now we take it the next step and we say that an infinite being's being is everywhere. It fills all space. There is no place where it isn't. Now are you feeling any possible problems? If God is everywhere and His being is infinite and permeates all things and fills all things, and there is no nook or cranny anywhere in the universe where God is absent. Again, the good news there is there's nowhere that I can go where I'm going to leave the presence of God. He is with me always. One thing that drives me crazy in modern evangelical Christianity, I listen to the television preachers and they tell us about name it and claim it. God always wills happiness, He always wills this, He always wills that, and God will never ask you to suffer. That's superstition. That's a nonsense. That's not the truth. That's not the gospel. The gospel I read says in the world you're going to have suffering. The promise of God is not that you won't suffer. The promise of God is that when you suffer, He will be there. That's our consolation. That God, in His infinite being, can be with us wherever we are. Now, again, do you think of the philosophical problem? If God is everywhere and is in everything, and there's no place where He is not, is there anything that He is not? How do we avoid the philosophical heresy that we call pantheism? Pantheism, in its literal meaning, says that all is God, or that God is everything, or that everything is at least a piece of God, a part of God. That's what pantheism teaches. Now, how do we avoid that if we believe that God is an infinite being? If an infinite being incorporates all being, wouldn't that necessarily come to the conclusion that everything is a piece of God? That you're a part of God? And we go back to the Stoic philosophy that there's a spark of divinity in everyone. And if everything's a part of God, then there'd be nothing wrong with worshiping trees or goats or cows, because in the being of the cow is the being of God, and in the being of the tree is the being of God. So what difference does it make whether we worship? Why do I have to worship this vague, abstract spirit? Why can't I worship the tree? Did you ever think about it? Let me tell you a little secret. It drives me crazy. Second thing drives me crazy. It's a short trip. But you get out most of your volumes of systematic theology, and you look up the attributes of God. And they'll list the attributes of God in these big, thick volumes of theology, and they'll talk about God's infinity and all, and omnipresence and immutability and so on. And they'll give you a page or two on each one. And it seems like the theologians can't wait to get past infinity to get on to the next one, because they don't want to have to deal with this problem. This problem is extremely weighty. It's extremely difficult. Again, if God is an infinite being, how could there be anything else besides God? If we can distinguish R.C. Sproul from God, and that there's a sense in which R.C. Sproul is not God, then somehow, somewhere, the being of God has to stop and the being of R.C. Sproul has to start. Do you see that? If we're going to be able to differentiate between that tree and God, then there's got to be a limit to the being of God. And if there is a limit to the being of God, then is he really an infinite being? Well, I think to work that through, we have to go back and understand that business about you can have two infinite lines. Why can you have two infinite lines, John? Why not? Could you have two infinite beings? How? You could have two. I agree you could have two infinite beings that are separate beings. For those two infinite beings to coexist, they would have to be at different levels of being. Just like we have an infinite line here in a certain dimension, and we go down here and we got another infinite line that goes. So you can have an infinite being. You can't have two infinite beings of the same type of being. But we must distinguish between the level of being that God enjoys and the level of being at which we live. We do not live at the same level of being that God does. In fact, it's more proper, instead of saying that we exist, it's more proper to say that we subsist. Again, the Bible tells us that in Him we live and move and have our being. It's by God's creative power that He keeps us alive. He keeps us existing. He makes it possible for me to be. And He is supporting me by His presence that permeates every particle of my body. And He permeates this rug, He permeates this chair, but He is not that chair. There's always a distinction between Himself and that which He creates outside of Himself. Remember that the ancient heresies were called modalism. And they looked at it like this, that God was sort of the center of being, like the sun that sends out rays. And as rays come out from the sun, or like ripples come out from the pond, you have different levels of being, but each level is a level of the being of God. That's pantheism. Now, what Christianity teaches is that there is the pure being of God, and God, by the power of creation, creates beings other than Himself. Now then He permeates those beings, but there is a distinction of being between God and the world. Now you say, why in the world would we even spend any time talking about something like this? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, as we will see in our next session, that the fundamental sin of the human race, according to the Scripture, is the sin of idolatry. And the very, opening commandments of God, of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and thou shalt not make what? Any graven image. For reasons that we don't always understand, God is fiercely jealous to protect us from idols. Religious people are the most vulnerable to the worship of idols. And the big problem with worshiping an idol is that you're worshiping something that is less than God. That's why we have to understand the difference between God and the world that God makes. Now, the difference between God and the world, as I understand it, is a difference of dimension. Do we have any mathematicians in here? Do we not have mathematical sciences that work on the fourth and fifth and sixth dimension? Yes, indeed. We have higher dimensional mathematics that compute and hang together and make sense. Now, that doesn't prove that such dimensions exist. But what the Scriptures tell us is that God is infinitely present, and that the barrier between me and God is not 10,000 miles between earth and heaven, but that there is a dimensional barrier that blocks me from being able to see what is really there. Now again, this carries over into the idea that God is spirit. And if we are Christians, we are committed to a supernatural view of man and of his world and of God. We believe in a God who can be present everywhere all the time. And I have only 20 seconds to say this last point. We also believe that this infinite God is immense. We believe in his immensity. Now, when we use that word in English and we say that something is immense, what do we mean, Bill? Large, great, big, or I think it's really big. But that's not what is meant by the term immensity when we apply it to God. When we talk about God's immensity, we mean this, very briefly, that wherever God is, he is present in his fullness. And it's not like part of God is in a cloud hanging over San Francisco and another part of God is in a cloud hanging over New York City. Or that the nose of God is over Paris and the toes of God is over Alaska. No. But that not only is God infinite and everywhere, but he is infinitely present in his fullness. So that when you fellowship with God, you fellowship with the whole God, and you fellowship with the whole God, and you fellowship with the whole God, and you can have his undivided attention at the same time that Bill over here is talking intimately to God. I can't conceive of that, to be honest with you, how that can be. But that's what the Scriptures reveal is the character of God. That his greatness so transcends what we're accustomed to, that he is in a different dimension altogether, so that the normal boundaries and borders that define our existence don't hold with him, so that we can walk with him and we can talk with him. And from his word, we know that we are his own.